We'll now hear from Dr. Lott. If you would please proceed.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate being invited here today. As we've heard many times today, blacks disproportionately face higher murder rates. People commit crimes primarily against people who are like themselves, both in terms of race and socioeconomic status. In my written testimony, I discuss how the costs of crime are much broader than just the direct victims of crime. And so I'm not going to go really through that right now. There are several points I want to make. One is single-parent families are a major contributing problem to all sorts of social problems, including crime. But unfortunately, the government has played a major role in the breakdown of families. Another point is, if you make it riskier for criminals to commit crime, you'll have less crime. You can stop crime with higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences, but you can also do it by letting victims be able to go and protect themselves with guns. Every place in the world that has banned either all guns or all handguns that we have crime data for has shown murder rates and homicide rates go up every single time. If guns on net are bad, as some have argued, you would think it would be easy to find lots of places that have banned guns where you see murder rates go down or at least stay the same, and yet every time they go up. If by randomness you'd think once or twice you would go and see that murder rates would go down, but yet they go up every single time. And the question is why? And the basic point is that when you ban guns, it's the most law-abiding good citizens who turn in their guns, not the criminals. And to the extent that you disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you may take a few guns away from criminals, you actually make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes. And this point applies to gun control laws generally, not just bans. You have to be careful that the gun control laws that you're passing aren't going to primarily disarm the victims that are there. I just want to make a couple quick points from earlier panels. With all the discussion about guns, it's important to recognize that 92% of violent crime has nothing to do with guns. Firearms are not the leading cause of death of children, despite being referenced several times today. A number of references have been made to AR-15s. Just so people know, AR-15s are small caliber, semi-automatic hunting rifles. They just look different, but they function identically to any semi-automatic gun. About 85% of the guns in the United States are semi-automatics. Assault weapons have not reduced the mass public shootings, the ban that we had from 94 to 2004. There's one academic, Louis Claririvas, has his own unique definition of mass shootings that he collects there, and that's the one that President Biden and others refer to constantly. But the problem that you have with that is that if you look at the percent of mass shootings, mass public shootings that involve assault weapons, even using his unique measure, it actually went up during that period of time. And the only way that could drive a decline is if the share fell over the period. As far as mass public shootings being a uniquely American problem that was mentioned by several of the people today, if you look over the last 20 years, the United States accounts for 4.6% of the world population, but 1% of the world's mass public shootings. There are many countries in Europe that have higher per capita rates of mass public shootings than the United States has. Guns in the home do not increase the risk of homicides and suicides. I can talk about that. I was chief economist for the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and I can tell you the sentencing guidelines increase disparity rather than decreasing it. And academic research shows that poverty rates changes only explain 1 to 2% of variation in crime rates. On to other things. If my research convinces me, if anything, it is the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from having guns and are harmed the most by gun control. The people who benefit the most are two groups. The people who are most likely victims of violent crime, and that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. And unfortunately, gun control laws discriminate against the poor and minorities. Let me just talk about background checks as an example. We frequently hear that there are 4 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been prevented from buying guns because of background checks. That's simply false. What they should say is there have been 4 million initial denials, and virtually all of those, about 99% of those, are mistakes, false positives. The thing is, when you go and you buy a gun, you're providing all this information. What they do in the next background check is look at roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays. The problem is that people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 33% of black males are felons. 18% of Hispanic males are felons. 6% of white males are felons. 3% of Asian males are felons. Where are you most likely going to see the mistakes being made then when you have looking at things like roughly phonetically similar names? You're going to be discriminating against law-abiding, good black and Hispanic males simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name to somebody who's a felon, who's prohibited. If private companies did background checks in the same way that the federal government does, under federal law, they'd be sued out of business. Why can't we require that the federal government have to meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet? You look at the fees. If I were to go and give John or somebody else here a gun here in DC, we'd have to go through a background check. It costs $125 to do a background check on a private transfer of a gun. I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm going to give one other person 4 guns. One person giving one other person 4 guns, you think it's just one background check because the same person is getting all guns. In DC, in most of the other states that have these background checks, these universal background checks, they require a separate background check on each gun. So rather than $125, it would cost $500 for me to transfer the guns from one person to another. Give me a benign explanation for why that's set up that way, other than just to make it costly for law-abiding people who are trying to go out of their way to go and obey the law to be able to go and protect themselves and their families. There's no other benign explanation other than making it costly. Who do you think you're stopping? You're stopping poor people. And the same thing with the errors in the background check system. You have a situation where middle income...
Dr. Lott, if you could wrap up.
Let people go for over a minute earlier today. I'm almost done.
Just go ahead and finish.
You have a system here where it's middle income and poor people who they can go and hire a lawyer to go and fix the mistakes in the background check system. But who wants to pay $3,000, even if they want to have a gun, even if they can afford to do it, just to fix a mistake that the government made and not the individuals? Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for recognizing me. You know, earlier on in this panel, I heard probably the greatest concentration of disinformation that I've seen in such a short time span. I served on the House Judiciary Committee with Jim Jordan and Matt Gaetz. The wackiest, probably, thing to emerge from this panel is somehow the idea that because of the commonality of black names, that universal background checks would not be effective at stemming the uniquely American problem with gun violence. And then, of course, there was also disinformation about what an assault weapons ban would actually accomplish. And so, Professor Sharkey, you're someone who's brought a lot of analytical rigor to your scholarship. Is there anything you'd like to respond to that was stated by Mr. Lott, for example, earlier on today's panel?
Well, this is a really hard topic to study, and I do think, there needs to be improvements in research, and over time there have been steady improvements. The virtual consensus. So, Dr. Lott has published a lot of research on gun laws. I think it's safe to say that most of that research has been debunked at this point. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the consensus that has emerged is that the argument that more guns leads to less crime is wrong. What we know is that there are a set of policies, most of them enacted at the state level. That's where we get the variation that we need to come close to identifying causal effects. Some of those policies, the most common ones that have been shown time and again to be causal and effective at reducing gun deaths. And I'm going to say gun deaths because it's not just homicides, it's suicides and gun accidents as well, are universal background checks, waiting periods, prohibited possessor laws, which do not allow people with domestic violence history or records to have access to guns. Now, other policies have much more mixed evidence. I think concealed carry laws, which Dr. Lott has studied, have mixed evidence. I'm not going to come out and say that there's slam dunk evidence that violence is going to fall next year if we get rid of concealed carry laws. So the body of evidence needs to improve. That said, what we know is that the accumulation of regulations that make it more difficult for people who shouldn't have a gun to access guns, that make it more difficult for dealers who will sell to anyone who walks in the door to stay in business, that makes it more difficult for children to access guns. These kinds of policies, when they accumulate, save thousands and thousands of lives, and that's causal. So it's not an accident that the states with the most restrictive gun regulations have the lowest rates of gun deaths. It's not an accident that's the nations with the most guns have the most gun deaths. You know, this evidence has accumulated, and there's virtually every scientist who studies this reaches this conclusion. And the ones who reach the opposite conclusion are the ones that get called on over and over. But it's like the climate change deniers. You know, you can find one or two who are going to dispute the evidence. Virtually everyone else is on the same page.
Thank you, Professor.
Go ahead, Dr. Lott. Your microphone.
Professor Sharkey didn't deal with what I thought was the most basic part of the question, is are there mistakes in the background check system? And, you know, just to give you an idea here, one of the big criticisms have been made when you have a Democratic president, Republicans say Democrats aren't enforcing the gun control laws. When there's a Republican president, Democrats say that. What's Exhibit A is the denials in the background check system. You almost never see prosecutions. You may say 200,000 times that people have been stopped because of the background check system. You see 20 prosecutions and 12 convictions. Why do you see so many? If you actually go and talk to the people who are involved in the prosecutions, they would say these are like the easiest things to go and prosecute people for. The reason why they're not prosecuting people is because they're not real cases. It's one thing to go and stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar birthday to the person who you want to stop. And so I have no problem with background checks, okay? My problem is that the current background check system discriminates against the very people who need guns the most for protection. Law-abiding, poor, black people who live in high-crime urban areas. And there's no reason anymore. If you were to go to a private company and say, should you do background checks on people that look at roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays, they will look like you're from Mars, because they're going to say you're going to be discriminating against minorities. You're going to create lots of false positives. If it's nuts for private companies to go and do background checks like that, why is it okay for the federal government in the NICS system to go and do that? Why? If you have 4 million people where almost all of those are mistakes, how is that justifiable? You know, there's a reason why you don't have prosecutions for these cases, whether it's across Democratic or Republican administrations. Now, with regard to the claims that my research has been debunked, I can give you dozens of peer-reviewed studies. In fact, there are many more that have found my research has stood up to all these different types of tests that are there. And I look at more than concealed carry. I've looked at many different types of gun control laws that are there. And as far as background checks, I wish it had the impact. Waiting periods actually have been associated with increases in violent crime rates for rape rates. You know, you may have a cooling off period, but you also make it difficult for victims, let's say a woman who's being stalked or threatened, to be able to quickly go and get a gun for self-defense. And so you have to go and look at the net effect that's there. As far as the assault weapons ban goes, I'll just give you, again, just a simple statistic. And that is, if the assault weapons ban actually worked, you should have seen the share of attacks involving assault weapons fall during the period when the ban was in effect. In fact, what you see is that the share of attacks went up when the assault weapons ban went into effect, and it fell when it went after. but why one would think that a ban on guns based on how they look rather than how they function is going to make any difference. You know, when Senator Feinstein's staff went through catalogs to go and look at guns based on how they look rather than how they function, when they're functionally identical guns that were still available there, makes no sense to me. But I'm sure other people on the panel may have thoughts about that. But I'm more than happy to give dozens of papers that have found my work even stronger effects than I have. And the thing is, if you look at the studies that tend to argue against me, look at later periods of time. And what happens is, if you look at the period, let's say from 2000 on, in these studies, you're comparing how the crime rates are changing in the states that changed those laws during those later periods versus all the states that adopted right to carry laws before that. In fact, the later states were much more restrictive. They had higher fees, longer training periods. They actually saw smaller increases in concealed carry permits than the earlier states. So the positive effect that they have there is actually the opposite of what they think it is, because what you really want to look at is the percent of the population with the permits, and there are other issues I could go into.
Thank you, Dr. Lott. We're going to be mindful of time here, so if we could keep our comments a little bit shorter. We'll go to Commissioner Jones. I don't know if you had another question.
Madam Chair, that's a lot to respond to that we just heard. A lot more disinformation, frankly.
What did I say that was wrong?
Almost everything, sir. And by the way, I'm looking at a 2-page document, just probably 20 different examples of how you've been called out for erroneous statements, much of which looks to be deliberate. But one of the things you added today, you suggested, in fact, you stated explicitly that, you know, you mentioned 4 million names, and you said almost all of those background searches have been inaccurate. Do you want to clarify that statement?
No, I don't want to clarify.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
Could you respond to the Inspector General's report that revealed that these background check denials are accurate in 99.8% of the cases?
Okay, what they did was they looked at 400, quote, judiciously sampled observations there. I don't know why. You would want to look at a random sample if you're going to look at that small of a group. But there's no reason to look at that small of a sample. We have the entire thing there. We know, for example, you can go and look through, there's basically 5 stages of review that occur when a NICS background check occurs. The first stage of review is the National BATF office. We'll look at them about...
Lott, I just want you to respond to the question.
I apologize. I just kind of want to move us along if I can.